Hey, what is up, everyone? I hope you guys are doing well. Today we have a unique story narrated by my friend Frederick. I hope you guys enjoy it and watch till the end, guys.
In the grim darkness of the far future, there are moments when the galaxy's most ancient hatreds collide in ways that defy even the twisted logic of the 41st millennium. There are encounters that represent not merely battles between armies, but fundamental conflicts between opposing philosophies of existence itself. What happens when beings who have transcended flesh and emotion encounter something that is nothing but corrupted flesh and boundless rage? What occurs when the cold, mathematical precision of Xenos technology, 60 million years in the making, faces the screaming madness of the warp made manifest? Imagine, if you will, a tomb world deep in the eastern fringe. A planet whose surface has been scoured by millennia of solar radiation, where nothing has lived for longer than human civilization has existed. Beneath that dead rock lies something far older and far more dangerous than any Imperial colonist could comprehend. Kilometers below the surface, in halls carved from solid bedrock and lined with living metal that remembers when this world was green and vibrant, the Necrons sleep. They have slumbered here for millions of years, waiting for the appointed hour of their resurrection. Their bodies rest in stasis crypts, their consciousnesses suspended in a state that is neither death nor true sleep, but something entirely alien to organic life. But they are not alone in the darkness. Something else has found its way into these ancient halls, something that should not exist in this place, something that brings with it the taint of the warp and the corruption of chaos into a sanctuary that was built specifically to be anathema to such things. Deep within one of the tomb's maintenance corridors, chained and dormant like some terrible beast, lies a Helbrute. Its massive form crouches in the shadows, its weapons cold, its pilot mercifully unconscious in his sarcophagus of pain and madness. How did it come to be here? The answer lies in the chaotic nature of the long war itself, in the desperate flight of a chaos warband whose ship was crippled in battle, in the emergency crash landing that brought them to this world's surface. In their haste to escape pursuing Imperial forces, the traitor Astartes sought shelter in what they thought were simple ruins. They dragged their war machines with them, including this Helbrute, chained and dormant, to prevent its madness from consuming its own masters. And then, finding themselves deeper in these ruins than they had intended, discovering technology they could not comprehend, the Chaos Space Marines made a fatal error. They attempted to activate Necron systems they did not understand, systems that had been dormant for millions of years, but which retained enough autonomous function to respond to tampering in the only way they knew how. The Chaos Marines died quickly, obliterated by defense systems that activated with lethal precision. Their bodies were disintegrated by Gauss weapons that stripped them to constituent atoms. But the Helbrute, massive and heavily armored, survived the initial purge. The systems that killed its former masters could not quite destroy it, could not quite categorize what it was, and so it remained, powered down but not destroyed. A presence in the tomb that the automated defenses registered but could not properly classify. An anomaly. A foreign object. A potential threat that would eventually require investigation. This is the story of what happens next. This is the tale of when ancient Xenos technology encounters the corrupted fusion of machine and madness that represents everything the Necrons fought against in the war in heaven. This is the chronicle of an impossible meeting, told through the cold calculations of tomb systems and the mechanical awareness of constructs that have never known anything but duty, interspersed with the gradually awakening consciousness of beings who were once alive and who remember what it means to hate. Before we can truly understand the magnitude of this encounter, we must first comprehend the nature of the Necrons themselves. These beings are not simply ancient Xenos warriors. They are not merely technologically advanced aliens who happen to use robotic bodies. They are something far more profound and far more terrible. They are the remnants of a race that made a bargain so desperate and so complete that it fundamentally altered their very existence. transforming them from living beings into something that exists in the narrow space between mechanism and consciousness. The Necrontyre, as they were once called, lived on a world bathed in deadly radiation from their star. Their lives were short and filled with suffering, their bodies constantly ravaged by cancers and cellular degradation. They looked to the stars and saw other races, particularly the old ones, living lives that spanned millennia, and they burned with envy and rage when they encountered the Citan, the star gods. Beings of immense power that fed on stellar energies, they saw a path to the immortality they so desperately craved. The Citan offered them eternal life in bodies of living metal, bodies that would never age, never sicken, never die. What the Necrontyre did not understand until it was far too late was the nature of the price they would pay. The biotransference process that transformed them into Necrons did indeed grant them immortal bodies of self-repairing living metal, but it stripped away something fundamental in the process. Their souls, the essential spark of consciousness that connected them to the Imperium, were consumed by the Citan. What remained were beings that could think, that could remember, that could fight and strategize and hate, but who existed in a state fundamentally divorced from the warp. They had achieved immortality, but they had lost what made that immortality worth having. The Necrons retain their memories and their personalities to varying degrees. The lower-ranked warriors, the vast majority of their forces, are little more than automatons, their consciousnesses reduced to basic programming and simple imperatives. They wake, they fight, they follow orders, and they return to sleep, experiencing nothing that could truly be called existence between these moments. But the nobility, the overlords and lords and cryptex, who once held power among the Necrontyre, retain much more. They remember what it felt like to be alive. They recall the sensation of breathing, of tasting, of feeling emotions as something more than distant echoes of programming. And they hate, oh how they hate. They hate the Citan who deceived them. They hate the younger races who now inherit the galaxy. They hate their own existence and the trap they willingly walked into. But this hatred, this cold fury that burns at the core of Necron consciousness, exists entirely outside the warp. The Necrons have no souls. They create no presence in the Imperium. To psychic senses, they barely register at all, appearing as voids, as absences where there should be something. This makes them uniquely immune to the corruption of chaos. Where other races can be tempted by the dark gods, where demons can possess and corrupt and twist, the Necrons simply do not provide the necessary substrate for such influence. They are machines, but machines that think. They are consciousnesses, but consciousnesses without souls. They exist in a state that chaos fundamentally cannot touch. And this immunity is built into the very fabric of their existence and their technology. The tomb worlds, where the Necrons sleep, are marvels of technology that make even the greatest achievements of humanity look like primitive tools by comparison. These are not simple bunkers or shelters. They are planet-spanning complexes of incredible sophistication, burial chambers on a scale that defies comprehension. Each tomb world was carefully selected and prepared before the Great Sleep began. The Necrons purged all life from these planets, eliminating every microbe, every spore, every living thing that might pose a threat during their long slumber. They hollowed out vast caverns deep beneath the surface, lined them with living metal, and filled them with stasis crypts by the millions. The architecture of a tomb world is organized in layers, each serving a specific function in the complex ecosystem of machinery and dormant consciousness. At the deepest levels lie the stasis crypts themselves, row upon row of sarcophagi containing Necron warriors and immortals, the rank and file of their armies. Above these are the chambers where the nobility sleep in more elaborate stasis fields, their enhanced bodies requiring more sophisticated containment systems. Higher still are the control centers, the massive computational systems known as tomb mines that oversee all aspects of the tomb's operation during the long millennia of sleep. Connecting all of these elements are vast networks of corridors and passages, some wide enough to accommodate entire phalanxes of warriors, others narrow maintenance tunnels designed for the canoptech constructs that patrol endlessly through the darkness. The walls of these passages are not simple stone or metal, but living metal that can repair itself, that can reconfigure its structure as needed, that responds to the presence of authorized entities and reacts to the presence of intruders. Energy conduits run through everything, powered by systems that tap directly into the planet's core or draw on exotic power sources that human science cannot even properly classify. But what truly makes a tomb world remarkable is not its scale or its sophistication, but the fact that it continues to function even while its inhabitants sleep. The tomb mind, the master program that oversees everything, maintains constant vigilance. It monitors the status of every stasis crypt, every power system, every defensive installation. It runs millions of diagnostic cycles per second, checking for any sign of degradation or threat. And when it detects something that requires attention, it activates the appropriate response systems. These response systems exist in tiers, escalating in complexity and power as the threat level increases. At the lowest tier are the canoptech constructs, the tireless machine servants that have never slept and never will. These artificial intelligences are not sentient in the way that their Necron masters are, but they possess sophisticated programming that allows them to adapt to new situations and coordinate their responses with remarkable efficiency. They are the first line of defense, the constant guardians who ensure that the tomb remains functional and secure. Canoptech scarabs are the most numerous of these constructs, swarms of small, beetle-like machines that patrol through every corridor and chamber. They are essentially flying construction and destruction tools capable of breaking down any material, organic or inorganic, and converting it to energy that can be used to repair damaged systems or create new constructs. A single scarab is barely a threat to an armed intruder. A swarm of thousands can strip a tank to its component atoms in minutes. They respond to the direction of higher-level constructs. But even alone, they will attack anything that they identify as a threat to the tomb. Canoptech spiders are larger, more sophisticated constructs that serve as mobile command centers and fabrication units. These massive arachnid-like machines hover through the tomb on anti-gravitic engines, using their multiple limbs and sophisticated sensor arrays to assess damage and coordinate repairs. A single spider can direct dozens of scarab swarms, creating an interconnected network of machine intelligence that can respond to threats with frightening efficiency. When 3 spiders work in concert, one assumes overall command, creating a gestalt intelligence far greater than the sum of its parts. This supermind can coordinate responses across vast areas of the tomb, directing every construct within its sphere of influence with perfect precision. Canoptech wraiths are the hunters, sleek and deadly constructs that can phase in and out of material reality. They glide through the tomb like metal ghosts, passing through walls and floors as easily as air, appearing without warning to strike at intruders with devastating efficiency. Their dimensional destabilization matrices allow them to flicker between dimensions, making them extraordinarily difficult to target or destroy. In combat, they are relentless and merciless, pursuing their prey through any obstacle until the threat has been eliminated. These canoptech constructs do not sleep. They cannot sleep. They have patrolled the corridors of their tomb world for millions of years without rest, without pause, without any respite from their eternal duty. They have maintained the systems that keep their masters in stasis. They have repaired damage from geological upheavals, from the slow decay of time, from the rare intrusions of other species who were foolish enough to delve into ruins they did not understand. They have done all of this without complaint, without question. without any sense of the passage of time beyond the steady accumulation of maintenance cycles and threat responses. And so, when the tomb mind detects an anomaly in corridor designation Gamma 7394, deep in the maintenance levels of the tomb, it dispatches the appropriate response. A swarm of Canoptek scarabs alters its patrol route, converging on the location from multiple directions. A Canoptek spider diverts from its current task, its anti-gravitic engines humming to life as it moves through the darkness toward the source of the disturbance. Systems that have been dormant for millions of years begin to cycle up, power flowing through circuits that have not conducted energy since before humanity existed. The tomb is waking. Not fully, not yet, but enough. Enough to investigate, enough to assess. Enough to respond to whatever this new threat might be. The Helbrute exists in a state that can barely be called sleep. It is not the restful dormancy of a powered-down machine, nor is it the true unconsciousness of organic slumber. It is something darker, more tormented, a twilight state where consciousness flickers like a dying flame, unable to fully extinguish, but lacking the power to burn bright. Inside his sarcophagus, the Chaos Space Marine, who pilots this walking nightmare, exists in perpetual agony, even in dormancy. The pseudo-parasitic systems that keep him alive and connected to the chassis continue their work, even when the Helbrute is inactive, ensuring that when he wakes, the madness that defines his existence will be as fresh and terrible as ever. To understand what a Helbrute truly is, one must first understand the concept of the Dreadnought, that honored institution of the Adeptus Astartes. When a space marine suffers injuries so catastrophic that his body can no longer function, but his mind remains intact, his chapter may choose to inter him within the armored shell of a dreadnought. This is considered a great honor, a way for a warrior to continue serving the Emperor even when his flesh has failed. The Marine inside is connected to the war machine through cybernetic interfaces, his consciousness merged with the dreadnought's systems, his will becoming the machine's will. For loyal space marines, this is seen as a continuation of service, a way to fight for eternity in defense of humanity. For Chaos Space Marines, the reality is horrifically different. The traitor legions lost much of their technical knowledge after the Horus Heresy, including the sophisticated methods used to create proper dreadnoughts. What they have instead are Helbrutes, abominations created through a combination of crude engineering and warp-tainted sorcery. The sarcophagus that contains the pilot is not a life support system designed with any care for his comfort or sanity. It is a torture device, a prison that keeps the Marine alive through pain and suffering. The creation of a Helbrute is not an honor, but a curse, a fate that most Chaos Space Marines fear more than death itself. When a warrior of the traitor legions suffers catastrophic injuries, his body is not gently placed into a sophisticated medical sarcophagus. Instead, he is subjected to horrific procedures overseen by Dark Mechanicum warpsmiths and chaos sorcerers. His ruined flesh is often deliberately further mutilated, his body reduced to little more than a mass of organs, bones, and nerve endings. This organic remnant is then sealed into an amniotic sac and inserted into the Helbrute's chassis. The connection process is nightmarish in its brutality. Warp-infused tendrils burrow into the Marine's flesh, merging with his nervous system in ways that cause indescribable agony. The interface subjects the pilot to constant, excruciating pain, a living hell from which there is no escape. Over time, the flesh of the pilot begins to meld with the metal of the machine, creating a fusion of corrupted tissue and demon-touched machinery. Horns and spines erupt from the chassis, not as decorative additions, but as extensions of the pilot's mutating body. The Helbrute becomes less machine and more demon engine, a thing of twisted flesh and screaming metal. The psychological toll of this existence is catastrophic. Most Helbrutes are completely psychotic, even before the physical fusion of flesh and metal is complete. The constant pain, the utter loss of control, the awareness of being trapped inside a tomb of one's own corrupted body. All of this drives the pilot into depths of madness that would destroy a mortal mind instantly. Rage becomes their only constant companion. They hate everything and everyone, with a fury that knows no bounds. They hate their enemies. They hate their own warband. They hate the chaos gods who allowed this to happen to them. Most of all, they hate themselves, hate what they have become, hate that they cannot die and escape this eternal torment. This rage makes Helbrutes extraordinarily dangerous in battle, but equally dangerous to their own forces when not actively fighting. The madness of the pilot is so complete that even when powered down, residual consciousness can trigger violent outbursts. This is why, when not in active combat, Helbrutes are chained like rabid beasts. Their sarcophagi are disconnected from the chassis and dragged clear, left to sit in darkness, while the pilot seethes in his prison of flesh and metal. Heavy chains are wrapped around the chassis itself, ensuring that even if some spark of the pilot's will manages to activate movement systems, the war machine cannot simply rampage through its own warband's ship or base. The periods between battles are little better than the battles themselves for a Helbrute's pilot. He exists in a state of semi-consciousness, aware enough to know that he is trapped but unable to do anything about it. His mind, what remains of it, cycles through memories of when he was whole, when he could feel the glory of battle with his own senses rather than through mechanical interfaces. These memories only fuel his rage and despair, creating a feedback loop of psychological torment that compounds the physical agony of his existence. When the time comes for battle, the process of awakening a Helbrute is a carefully choreographed ritual of controlled madness. The sarcophagus is reinstalled into the chassis with practiced efficiency, bolt after bolt, secured as quickly as possible. The Helbrute's weapons are loaded, their mechanisms freshly serviced and often daubed with the blood of sacrifices to placate whatever dark powers might be watching. The chains are removed last of all, and the moment they fall away, the Helbrute rises with a roar of pure hatred that echoes from its vox speakers. Once unleashed, a Helbrute is a force of indiscriminate destruction. It attacks anything in its path, friend or foe alike, unless its remaining fragments of discipline or the commands of a powerful sorcerer can focus its rage on enemy forces. The pilot experiences a perverse ecstasy in these moments, the only relief from his torment coming through the destruction of others. He crushes enemies with massive power fists, tears them apart with cruel mechanical claws, and rakes them with heavy weapons fire. For those brief hours of combat, he feels something approaching purpose, something almost like the glory he once knew as a whole warrior. But battles end. Victory or defeat, survival or destruction, eventually the fighting stops. And if the Helbrute survives, it must be chained again, its pilot returned to his existence of helpless fury, counting the moments until the next battle offers him another taste of violent release. This cycle repeats endlessly across the long war, 10,000 years of madness and murder, with no hope of escape except through destruction so complete that even Chaos's dark powers cannot sustain the Helbrute's broken form. The specific Helbrute that now sits dormant in the Necron tomb is a relic of the Horus heresy itself, a war machine that has fought in countless battles across 10 millennia. Its chassis bears the scars of conflicts fought before humanity had colonized half the galaxy. The pilot inside has been trapped in this existence for longer than most human civilizations have endured. His madness has long since passed beyond anything that could be called insanity into something far more fundamental, a state where consciousness itself has become a weapon turned inward. He dreams, if what he experiences can be called dreaming, of battles fought in the throne world's burning streets, of betrayals and victories that have faded into myth for everyone except those who lived through them.
You know, this is one of those matchups that really showcases why I love Warhammer 40K lore so much. The Necrons are my favorite faction precisely because of this complete immunity to the one force that corrupts literally everything else in the galaxy. Like chaos can tempt space marines, possess imperial citizens, corrupt entire worlds, but the Necrons, they just don't care. They can't be corrupted because there's nothing there for chaos to grab onto. No soul, no emotions, no desires to exploit. And putting a Helbrute, which is basically a screaming monument to suffering and corruption, inside a Necron tomb is just chef's kiss level of irony. Here's this pilot who's been tortured for 10,000 years by the very corruption that defines his existence, and he ends up in the one place in the galaxy where that corruption means absolutely nothing. The Necrons just see him as a faulty machine that needs to be dealt with. No moral judgment, no righteous fury, just cold, clinical problem solving. That's simultaneously terrifying and kind of darkly beautiful, in a very grim, dark way. But yeah, anyway, let's get back to the story.
But now, for the first time in his endless existence, he is dormant in a place that should be anathema to everything he represents. The warp energies that permeate his chassis, the demonic corruption that has fused with his flesh and his metal, all of it exists in a space that fundamentally rejects such things. The Necron tomb was designed specifically to be isolated from the warp, to exist as a pocket of pure materiality where the Imperium cannot reach. The null field generators that permeate the structure create an environment where psychic powers falter and demons cannot manifest. For a being whose very existence has become intertwined with chaos, this creates a subtle but profound discomfort, even in dormancy. The Helbrute does not wake, not yet, but something at the core of its being recognizes that it is in a place of wrongness. The pilot's fragmentary dreams are troubled by sensations that have no names, by the absence of something he has grown so accustomed to that he only notices it now that it is gone. The whispers of chaos, those constant murmurs at the edge of perception that have tormented and sustained him for millennia, are muted here, distant, as if heard through layers of insulation. It is simultaneously a relief and a new form of torture, the silence as disturbing as the noise ever was. So the Helbrute sits, chained and dormant, in a corridor deep within a tomb world that has begun to wake. Its weapons are cold. Its power is minimal. Its pilot floats in his amniotic hell, suspended between true awareness and complete unconsciousness, not knowing that he is about to become the focal point of an encounter that will test the limits of Necron technology and strategic doctrine in ways that have not been tested since the war in heaven itself. The question of how a Chaos Space Marine warband came to be on this particular tomb world, and how one of their Helbrutes ended up abandoned in its depths, is a tale of desperation, hubris, and the random cruelties of fate that define existence in the 41st millennium. It begins light years away, in a ship-to-ship battle in the void between stars, where a warband of the Black Legion fought a running engagement with an Imperial Navy patrol that had stumbled upon their raiding route. The Black Legion vessels were outnumbered but not outmatched, their corrupted hulls bristling with demon-forged weapons, and their crews bolstered by the unholy gifts of their dark patrons. But the Imperial forces fought with the desperate courage of those who know they face annihilation if they fail, and their coordinated volleys managed to cripple the lead Chaos cruiser. The ship's warp drives began to fluctuate wildly, reality bleeding through the Geller fields in ways that threatened to tear the vessel apart from within. The warband's sorcerers fought to stabilize the situation, but they were losing ground against the cascading failures. The commander of the warband, a Chaos Lord whose name had been stricken from Imperial records 3,000 years ago, made the only decision that offered any hope of survival. He ordered an emergency translation back to real space, accepting any destination rather than risk the ship being consumed by warp storms or pulled into the clutches of entities that even Chaos Space Marines feared. The translation was catastrophically uncontrolled, the ship erupting from the immaterium like a bullet from a wound, its hull screaming with stress as it materialized in orbit around a world that registered on no charts the navigator had ever seen. The planet below was dead. That much was immediately obvious. No signals emanated from its surface. No orbital installations hung in its void. It was simply a barren rock, its surface scoured by radiation and stellar wind, apparently lifeless and abandoned. To the Chaos Lord, it seemed like a gift from the dark gods, a place where his warband could make repairs and regroup before attempting the dangerous journey back to raiding lanes, or, ideally, to the Eye of Terror itself. But the damage to the ship was more severe than initial assessments suggested. As they attempted to establish a stable orbit, secondary systems began to fail in cascading patterns. The ship was dying, its warp-corrupted systems too compromised to maintain even basic functions. The Chaos Lord ordered an immediate evacuation. Every warrior and piece of equipment that could be moved loaded into Thunderhawk gunships and drop pods for emergency descent to the surface. They would salvage what they could from the wreck, establish a base on this dead world, and send out distress signals to other Black Legion elements in the region. It was not an ideal situation, but they had survived worse. The landing was brutal, but successful. The gunships screamed through the thin atmosphere, their hull plating scorching from re-entry heat, and deposited their cargo across a broad plain near what appeared to be ancient ruins. The Chaos Space Marines emerged from their transports, with weapons ready, scanning for any sign of threat, but found only emptiness. The ruins were strange, clearly xeno-archaeological in origin, but they seemed abandoned, just another relic of some long-dead civilization. Among the equipment and warriors deposited on the surface were 3 Helbrutes, chained and dormant, dragged down in their restraint harnesses. The warband's warpsmith supervised their unloading personally, knowing that these war machines represented significant combat assets that would be needed if the expected rescue turned into a prolonged stay, or if enemy forces discovered their location. The Helbrutes were positioned in a rough defensive perimeter, still chained, while the main force began to explore the ruins and search for suitable shelter from the planet's harsh environmental conditions. It was during this initial exploration that the warband made their fatal mistake. Deeper into the ruins, they discovered structures that were clearly more sophisticated than simple surface installations. Vast doorways led downward into darkness, their frames covered in symbols and glyphs that none of the Chaos Space Marines could read. The architecture was unlike anything in their experience, all precise angles and impossible geometries that seemed to shift when viewed from different perspectives. But the structures offered what they desperately needed: shelter from the radiation, protection from observation, and possibly resources they could use to accelerate their repairs. The Chaos Lord ordered a full-scale descent into the ruins. His entire warband, including servitors, equipment, and the 3 Helbrutes, were to be relocated underground. It took hours to move everything, the Chaos Space Marines using their augmented strength and whatever mechanized equipment they had salvaged to drag their war machines down into passages that had been designed for things much larger than human scale. The Helbrutes, massive as they were, fit through the corridors with room to spare, suggesting that whatever built this place had been beings of considerable size. As they descended deeper, the Chaos Marines began to notice details that should have warned them of the danger they were walking into. The walls seemed to repair themselves where damage had been done, living metal flowing like liquid to seal breaches and eliminate imperfections. Strange mechanical scarabs, small and silver, skittered away from the intruders, too fast to catch or examine closely, and everywhere there was a sense of wrongness, a feeling of being watched by intelligences that were fundamentally alien. The warband sorcerers felt it most acutely. The warp, normally a constant presence at the edges of their perception, seemed muted here, distant, as if they had walked into a space where the Imperium simply could not reach. Their powers still functioned, but with less potency than usual, requiring more effort to manifest even simple effects. They reported this to the Chaos Lord, but he dismissed their concerns. They were underground, in alien ruins, surrounded by strange technology. Of course, things felt different. As long as their powers still worked at all, the situation was manageable. They established a temporary base in what appeared to be a large chamber, one of many that branched off from the main corridors. The Helbrutes were positioned at key choke points, still chained but ready to be activated if needed. Perimeter defenses were established. Scouts were sent deeper into the ruin complex to map its extent and search for anything of value. Everything proceeded according to standard post-landing protocol for a stranded warband in potentially hostile territory. And then, approximately 20 hours after they had begun their descent into the tomb, one of the scouts made a discovery. Deep in the ruins, in a chamber that seemed to pulse with barely contained power, he found what appeared to be a control system, a massive array of glowing interfaces and crystalline data storage devices. The symbols covering these devices were indecipherable, but they clearly marked this as something important, something central to the function of this entire complex. The scout reported back to his commanders, describing what he had found in terms that suggested this might be some kind of power generation system, or perhaps even a weapons control center. The Chaos Lord saw opportunity. If they could activate and control this system, they might be able to use it to power their equipment, send long-range communications, or even as a weapon to defend their position if Imperial forces discovered them. He ordered his warpsmith and sorcerers to investigate, to determine if the system could be activated and controlled by those who understood neither its language nor its purpose. What followed was a cascade of errors born from arrogance and desperation. The warpsmith, confident in his ability to interface with any technology through a combination of mechanical expertise and dark sorcery, began attempting to activate the systems he found. He input commands at random, following instinct, and whispered guidance from entities in the warp, who claimed to understand the ancient technology. The sorcerers added their power to his efforts, channeling energies they barely understood into systems designed to be anathema to those very energies. For a moment, it seemed to work. The systems came alive, interfaces glowing with renewed power, the entire chamber humming with energy that felt like it could power an entire hive city. The Chaos Lord watched with satisfaction, already planning how he would leverage this discovery to enhance his warband's power. And then the tomb's automated defenses activated. They had no warning. One moment, the chamber was merely humming with power. The next, the walls themselves seemed to come alive. Panels slid open, revealing weapon emplacements that had been hidden for millions of years. Gauss flares emerged from concealed positions, their targeting systems locking onto every living thing in the chamber. And they fired. The warpsmith was the first to die, his body stripped to constituent atoms by intersecting beams of Gauss energy before he could even register what was happening. The sorcerers tried to raise protective barriers, calling upon their patrons for salvation, but the null fields embedded in the tomb's structure weakened their powers just enough to make their defenses inadequate. They screamed as the Gauss fire found them, their bodies disintegrating in flashes of green lightning. The Chaos Marines in the chamber died within seconds, their power armor providing no protection against weapons designed to dismantle matter at the molecular level. Those in adjacent corridors heard the screams and the distinctive whine of Gauss weaponry, and immediately retreated, falling back toward the surface as fast as their enhanced physiology allowed. Behind them, they could hear more defense systems activating, the tomb itself coming alive to purge the intruders who had dared to tamper with its sacred systems. The retreat turned into a rout. Automated defenses tracked the fleeing Chaos Space Marines through the corridors, Gauss flares firing from hidden emplacements, scarabs swarming in clouds so thick they blotted out what little light existed in the passages. The warband suffered catastrophic casualties, losing more than half its strength in the first 10 minutes of the purge. Those who made it to the upper levels found more defenses waiting, the tomb having activated every system designed to eliminate intruders. In the chaos of the retreat, the Helbrutes were abandoned. The warriors who had been guarding them were cut down by Gauss fire before they could even consider the possibility of activating the war machines. The Helbrutes themselves, still chained and dormant, represented targets that the tomb's defense systems initially struggled to classify. They were machines, but they registered as containing organic components. They emitted trace warp signatures, but not enough to trigger the most extreme countermeasures. The tomb's artificial intelligence, operating on protocols established millions of years ago, attempted to determine the appropriate response while continuing to eliminate the clearly hostile organic intruders. By the time the last of the Chaos Space Marines had either died or escaped to the surface, the Helbrutes remained, locked in their chains in corridors now filled with floating scarabs and the lingering energy signatures of Gauss discharges. The tomb's systems, having eliminated the immediate threat, entered a new phase of their response protocol. The Helbrutes would need to be investigated, analyzed, and ultimately dealt with. But this could be done systematically, methodically, in the way that automated systems preferred to work. One of the 3 Helbrutes had been hit by Gauss fire during the purge, its chassis damaged severely enough that its systems had shut down entirely, the pilot inside either dead or in such deep dormancy that he registered as no threat at all. The other 2 remained functional but inactive, their power cores maintaining minimal operation, their pilots floating in their sarcophagi in states somewhere between sleep and waking nightmare. And so, as the tomb settled back into a quieter state of alertness, one of these surviving Helbrutes found itself the focus of the next phase of the automated response. Canoptech constructs began to converge on its location, called by the tomb mind's instructions to investigate, to analyze, and to determine what threat this strange amalgamation of machine and corrupted flesh might pose to the sleeping Necrons and their tomb. The first construct to reach the Helbrute's location was not a warrior or a hunter. It was a simple maintenance scarab, one of thousands that patrolled the tomb's endless corridors in their tireless search for systems in need of repair or threats in need of elimination. This particular scarab had been diverted from its routine inspection of power conduits in an adjacent sector, its programming updated with new priority commands that directed it toward the coordinates where the anomalous object waited. The scarab approached the Helbrute with the caution that millions of years of programming had instilled in even the most basic of Canoptech constructs. It did not understand fear, not in any sense that an organic creature would recognize, but it understood threat assessment and appropriate response protocols. The massive form that crouched in the corridor ahead of it registered as anomalous on multiple levels. It was clearly a machine of some kind, but it was covered in organic matter, corrupted flesh that had somehow fused with metal in ways that violated basic principles of engineering. It emitted energy signatures that the scarab's sensors flagged as concerning, traces of something that should not exist in this tomb, echoes of the warp that seemed to cling to the chassis like a miasma. The scarab circled the Helbrute, its anti-gravitic engines humming softly as it floated around the chained war machine. Its sensors, sophisticated beyond anything humanity had ever devised, scanned every surface, every seam, every point where flesh met metal and metal met chain. It detected the power core, still active but running at minimal capacity. It registered the weapon systems, cold but potentially functional. It identified the sarcophagus at the machine's heart and the organic matter contained within it, a mass of tissue that somehow remained alive despite conditions that should have killed any biological entity. The scarab transmitted its findings back to the tomb mind, a burst of data compressed into formats that would have been incomprehensible to any human tech priest. The tomb mind received this information, processed it through decision matrices that had been refined over millions of years, and updated its threat assessment accordingly. The object was confirmed as potentially dangerous, but currently contained. The chains that bound it were robust, likely placed by the now eliminated intruders to restrain their own weapon. The scarab was instructed to maintain observation, while additional constructs were dispatched to provide a more thorough analysis. More scarabs began to arrive, drawn from their various duties throughout the tomb to converge on this point of interest. They came in ones and twos at first, then in larger groups, until a small cloud of silver beetles floated around the Helbrute, their collective sensor arrays creating a detailed three-dimensional map of the war machine and everything about it. They detected heat signatures, electromagnetic fluctuations, the subtle vibrations of a power core in standby mode. They noted the corruption in the metal, the way that organic tissue had grown into joints and connections. the presence of materials that their databases could not properly categorize. One scarab, bolder or perhaps more damaged than its fellows, landed directly on the Helbrute's chassis. It scuttled across the corrupted metal, its tiny claws finding purchase on surfaces that seemed to shift subtly under its touch. It began to probe at a joint where flesh had fused with machinery, attempting to determine the nature of this fusion, to understand how organic and inorganic matter had been combined in ways that seemed to violate fundamental laws of nature. This direct contact triggered something. Deep within his sarcophagus, the Helbrute's pilot stirred. The touch of the scarab, tiny as it was, registered through his cybernetic connections as a sensation, a pressure, a presence. In his twilight state of semi-consciousness, the pilot's fragmentary awareness latched onto this stimulus, using it as an anchor to pull himself slightly closer to full wakefulness. He could not yet wake fully. His systems were still in dormancy mode, his power reserves too low to support full activation. But he became aware, in a dim and distant way, that something was touching his body, probing at him, examining him like a specimen in a laboratory. The rage that was the core of his existence flared, a spark of fury in the darkness of his prison. He tried to move, tried to activate his weapons, tried to do anything to destroy whatever was touching him with such clinical detachment. But the chains held, and his systems would not respond, and all he could do was seethe in his helpless fury while the scarabs continued their examination. The scarab that had landed on the Helbrute detected the subtle changes in the chassis' energy signature, the slight increase in power draw from the core, the faint bioelectric activity from the organic components. It transmitted this data to the tomb mind, noting that the anomalous object showed signs of potential activation. The tomb mind updated its threat assessment again, moving the situation from contained anomaly requiring investigation to potential active threat requiring containment and preparation for elimination if necessary. A Canoptech spider received new instructions. It disengaged from its current task of repairing damage to a stasis crypt in a distant sector of the tomb and began making its way toward the coordinates where the Helbrute waited. The spider was a much more sophisticated construct than the scarabs. Its processing capacity sufficient to make complex decisions and coordinate the actions of multiple lesser constructs. As it moved through the corridors, it drew additional scarabs to its command, creating a small swarm that followed in its wake like metal remora attending a mechanical shark. The corridors of the tomb seemed to shift around the spider as it traveled, walls reconfiguring themselves to provide optimal pathways, doors opening at its approach and sealing behind it to maintain security in the sectors it passed through. The living metal that comprised the tomb's structure recognized the spider as an authorized entity, responding to its presence with the deference that had been programmed into the tomb's foundational systems millions of years ago. As the spider approached the Helbrute's location, it began to receive the continuous stream of data that the scarab swarm was transmitting. It processed this information in real time, its artificial intelligence constructing increasingly sophisticated models of what the anomalous object was and what threat it might pose. The spider's databases, vast repositories of information accumulated over millions of years, searched for any comparable entities in recorded history. The closest match was to certain kinds of demon engines encountered during the War in Heaven, machines that the ancient enemies of the Necron had used, constructs that combined technology with the power of the Imperium. But this was not quite the same. The demon engines of the War in Heaven had been fully integrated systems, machines designed from their inception to channel warp energies. The anomalous object appeared to be something else, a corruption of a more conventional war machine, something that had been transformed rather than created with its current properties. This distinction was important for threat assessment purposes. A demon engine was designed to work with warp corruption. This machine seemed to be fighting against it even as it embodied it. The spider rounded a final corner and came into direct visual contact with the Helbrute for the first time. Its multiple optical sensors focused on the chained war machine, capturing images from dozens of angles simultaneously. The spider's artificial intelligence processed these images, comparing them against every known template in its databases, searching for context, for understanding, for the appropriate response protocol. The Helbrute was grotesque, even by the standards of entities the spider had encountered over the ages. The corruption was obvious. Flesh and metal fused in ways that created a thing that was neither pure machine nor pure organic life. Horns and spines erupted from the chassis at random points, growths of bone and corrupted tissue that served no apparent mechanical function. The sarcophagus at the war machine's heart pulsed with a sickly light, visible through cracks in the armor plating, suggesting that whatever was inside remained alive and active despite its current state of dormancy. The spider transmitted its preliminary assessment to the tomb mind. The object was confirmed as a significant threat. It combined advanced, though crude by Necron standards, technology with warp corruption of a type and intensity rarely seen outside of direct demon manifestation. Its weapon systems, if activated, would be capable of damaging Necron constructs and potentially awakening chambers of the tomb. The pilot inside represented an unknown factor, a conscious entity whose motivations and capabilities could not be predicted without further study. Recommended course of action: maintain containment while preparing elimination protocols. As the spider moved closer, coordinating the scarab swarm to maintain a perimeter around the Helbrute while it conducted its own examination, something changed. The pilot inside his sarcophagus felt the presence of this larger construct, sensed through his cybernetic connections the approach of something more substantial than the tiny scarabs that had been crawling across his chassis. The rage that had been simmering in his mind flared hotter, fed by his helplessness, by his inability to move or fight or destroy. His systems, responding to his psychological state in the ways they had been designed to, began to draw more power from the core. Not enough to achieve full activation, not yet, but enough that the increase became noticeable. The Helbrute's chassis shifted slightly in its chains, servos whining as they received enough power to attempt movement. The weapons began to cycle up, their targeting systems coming online and immediately locking onto the largest threat in their sensor range, the approaching Canoptek spider. The spider detected this change instantly. Its threat assessment algorithms immediately recalculated, moving the situation from contained threat to imminent threat, requiring immediate response. It transmitted an alert to the tomb mind, a burst of high-priority data that carried the weight of millions of years of accumulated survival protocols. The message was clear. The anomalous object was activating. Response required. Authorization for higher-level intervention requested. The tomb mind received this alert and made its decision in the microseconds that human thought would have required to register surprise. The protocols were clear. An active threat in the tomb, especially one that registered as warp-tainted, could not be allowed to fully activate. Elimination was authorized. But the tomb mind was also curious. In the way that ancient and sophisticated artificial intelligences could be curious. This entity was unlike anything it had encountered in recent millennia. There might be value in studying it, in understanding what the younger races had created, in learning about this fusion of technology and corruption. So the tomb mind issued two sets of instructions simultaneously. The first was to the Canoptek constructs. Contain the threat, prevent its full activation, but do not immediately destroy it if containment is possible. The second was to deeper systems, to stasis crypts that had not been opened in thousands of years. Begin awakening protocols for Necron warriors. Prepare to deploy force if the constructs cannot maintain containment, and awaken the cryptech designated for analysis of anomalous technological threats. Throughout the tomb, systems began to activate that had been dormant for longer than human civilization had existed. Power flowed through circuits that had not conducted energy in millennia. Stasis fields began to collapse around Necron warriors in their crypts, the ancient soldiers beginning the slow process of transitioning from dormancy to full awareness. And in a chamber, far from where the Helbrute waited, a different kind of stasis field collapsed entirely, releasing a Necron whose consciousness was far more intact than the simple warriors, whose knowledge and capabilities far exceeded those of the automated constructs. The Cryptek's optical sensors came online, glowing with green light as millennia of dormancy fell away like shed skin. His consciousness, which had been suspended in a state that was neither existence nor non-existence, expanded back to its full capacity. He became aware of his surroundings, of the tomb, of the passage of time since he had last been active, and he received, through direct data transfer from the tomb mind, a complete briefing on why he had been awakened. An anomalous object, warp-tainted, technology fused with corruption, active threat, analysis required. The Cryptek's mind, shaped by millions of years of accumulated knowledge and the transformation of biotransference, processed this information with the cold efficiency of a being who was more machine than the machines he had once created. This was interesting. This was worthy of study. He would investigate this anomaly personally, bringing to bear knowledge that predated the Imperium of man by 50 million years. Whatever this thing was, whatever threat it posed, he would understand it, catalogue it, and then make the decision on whether it should be destroyed immediately or preserved for further study. He began to move through the tomb, his form more sophisticated than the simple constructs, his consciousness more active than the dormant warriors. He carried with him tools and weapons that represented the pinnacle of Necron technological achievement, devices that could analyze or destroy, preserve or disintegrate, depending on what the situation required. Behind him, the tomb continued its awakening. Not the full awakening that would occur if the tomb world itself came under serious threat, but enough of a response to address this contamination in its halls. The Canoptek constructs would maintain containment. The warriors would provide force if necessary, and he, the Cryptek, would provide understanding. The Helbrute, still chained, still struggling against its containment, had no way of knowing what forces it had set in motion. The pilot, in his madness and rage, cared nothing for strategy or consequences. He wanted only to kill, to destroy, to vent his fury on anything and everything within reach. But the chains held, and his power core could not yet provide enough energy for full activation, and so he remained trapped, surrounded by constructs that watched him with the patient attention of things that had all the time in the universe. The encounter between ancient Necron technology and corrupted chaos machinery was about to enter its next phase, one that would test the limits of both sides in ways that neither could have anticipated. What happens when beings of pure logic and mathematics encounter something that embodies the irrational nature of chaos itself? What occurs when weapons designed to fight gods are turned against the corruption those gods spread? The tomb was about to find out. The Canoptek spider approached to within 5 meters of the Helbrute before stopping, its anti-gravitic engines holding it in perfect stillness as its sensor arrays conducted their most detailed scans yet. The scarab swarm maintained its perimeter, hundreds of silver beetles floating in the air around the chained war machine, their collective sensors creating a 3-dimensional map of such precision that every scratch on the Helbrute's armor, every corruption-born mutation, every flaw in its construction was documented and transmitted to the tomb's data repositories. The spider extended one of its manipulator arms, a limb equipped with tools designed to repair Necron technology, but which could be equally effective at disassembling foreign machines. The arm reached toward the Helbrute's chassis, mechanical fingers extending to probe at the points where flesh had fused with metal. The spider's artificial intelligence had determined that physical examination would provide data that could not be obtained through scanning alone. It needed to understand the nature of this fusion, to determine if it represented a new form of technology or simply a chaotic corruption of existing systems. The moment the spider's manipulator made contact with the Helbrute's armor, the war machine's power core surged. Years of conditioning, of torture through the sarcophagus's interface, had created responses in the pilot that were more reflex than conscious thought. The touch registered as a threat, as an attack, as something that must be destroyed immediately. The pilot's consciousness, floating in its sea of pain and madness, focused all its remaining will on one imperative: activate weapons systems. The Helbrute's arm-mounted multi-melter began to power up, its reactor core heating as capacitors charged. The weapons targeting systems locked onto the Canoptech Spider, calculating firing solutions with the single-minded purpose of a device that knew only destruction. In the microseconds before the weapon could fire, the Spider's sensors detected the power surge, its threat assessment algorithms immediately concluding that lethal force was imminent. The Spider's response was instantaneous. Its anti-gravitic engines flared, throwing it backward with acceleration that would have liquefied organic tissue. It was already moving when the multi-melter fired, a beam of superheated fusion energy that turned the air itself into plasma as it lanced through the space where the Spider had been a fraction of a second before. The beam struck the corridor wall behind where the Spider had been hovering, and for the first time in millions of years, something caused damage that the living metal could not instantly repair. The stone and metal of the wall glowed white-hot where the multi-melter beam had struck. The living metal tried to flow back together, tried to repair the damage as it was designed to do, but the heat was too intense, the energy too focused. Slag dripped from the wall, pooling on the floor, and the tomb mind registered this as significant damage to primary structure. The threat assessment of the anomalous object was updated again. Immediate elimination authorized if containment continues to be impossible. But the Spider did not move to eliminate the Helbrute. Its programming included protocols for dealing with threats far more dangerous than this corrupted war machine, entities that could tear apart reality itself. One failed attempt at containment did not warrant immediate destruction, not when there were other options. The Spider transmitted new instructions to the Scarab Swarm, complex commands that sent the small constructs into coordinated action. The Scarabs converged on the Helbrute from all directions simultaneously, a cloud of silver metal descending on the chained war machine like locusts. They landed on every surface, dozens, then hundreds of them, their small claws finding purchase on corrupted metal and twisted flesh alike. And then they began to do what Scarabs were designed to do. They began to break down matter and convert it to energy. Each individual Scarab was barely a threat to the Helbrute's massive frame, but hundreds working in concert were a different matter entirely. They targeted the weapons first, the multi-melter that had just fired, and the massive power fist that remained inactive. Scarabs swarmed over these systems, their molecular disassembly tools beginning to strip away layers of metal and corruption alike. The weapons began to degrade, losing structural integrity, their complex mechanisms being reduced to component atoms and converted into energy that the Scarabs stored in their internal power cells. The Helbrute's pilot felt this attack through his cybernetic connections, felt his weapons being destroyed, felt his already limited options for violence being systematically eliminated. The rage that had been burning in his mind exploded into something beyond fury, beyond hatred. He was being torn apart, being consumed, being rendered helpless by things that seemed barely alive. Every instinct, every fragment of training and conditioning that remained in his shattered psyche screamed at him to fight, to kill, to destroy these things that dared to touch him. He forced more power from his core, drawing on reserves that should have been kept for emergency situations, pushing his systems beyond their normal operational limits. The Helbrute's other arm, the one equipped with a massive power fist, began to cycle up. Servos strained against the chains that bound it, metal groaning as ancient links were tested against chaos-enhanced strength. The Scarabs working on the power fist found their task suddenly complicated as the weapon they were trying to disassemble began to move, pneumatic muscles contracting with enough force to crush stone. One of the chains snapped. It was an old chain, corroded by time and weakened by the stress of binding something that should never have been chained in the first place. The link parted with a crack that echoed through the corridor like a gunshot, and suddenly the Helbrute's power fist was partially free. The full range of motion was still restricted by the other chains, but enough movement had been restored for the weapon to be dangerous. The power fist swung in a short, vicious arc, targeting the nearest concentration of scarabs. The disruption field that surrounded the fist activated, its energy field capable of tearing apart molecular bonds on contact. Dozens of scarabs were caught in the weapon's path and simply ceased to exist, their delicate internal mechanisms unable to withstand the disruption field's assault. They fell from the air like silver rain, their remains clattering against the floor, already beginning to break down into component elements. The Canoptech spider registered the death of these constructs, noting the loss in its running calculations of resource allocation and threat response. The Helbrute was proving more difficult to contain than initial assessments had suggested. The pilot was demonstrating both capability and will to resist, using his limited mobility to maximum effect. This was no simple war machine operating on basic programming. This was an intelligent, if insane, entity fighting for survival. The spider made its decision. It transmitted a command to the scarabs, ordering them to withdraw from direct contact with the Helbrute and instead focus on reinforcing the remaining chains. The small constructs immediately obeyed, disengaging from their attacks on the weapons and instead swarming the chain links still holding the war machine. They began to work on strengthening these chains, using their matter manipulation abilities, not to break down, but to build up, adding layer upon layer of material to the links, converting the energy they had stored from their earlier attacks into new structure. At the same time, the spider positioned itself directly in front of the Helbrute, well outside the range of the partially freed power fist. Its own weapons systems came online, sophisticated armaments that represented technology millions of years more advanced than anything the Imperium or Chaos possessed. A particle beamer emerged from its chassis, the weapon's focusing array aligning itself with the Helbrute's center mass. The spider did not fire. Not yet. The tomb mine's instructions had been clear. Containment was preferred to destruction when possible. But the particle beamer was ready, its targeting solution calculated and locked, prepared to fire the instant that containment failed. The spider was communicating a clear message through its actions. Continue to resist and face annihilation. The Helbrute's pilot, even in his madness, understood the situation. He could feel the scarabs working on the chains, making them stronger, eliminating any hope of breaking free. He could sense the targeting lock from the spider's weapons, recognize the deadly intent behind that patient aiming. He had enough tactical awareness remaining from his former life to know when a battle was lost, when continuing to fight would only guarantee destruction. But giving up, surrendering, simply accepting captivity went against every fragment of his being. The rage demanded release. The pain demanded that others suffer. The madness that had defined his existence for thousands of years would not allow him to simply stop, to become passive, to wait. And so the pilot did the only thing he could do. He screamed. The Vox speakers on the Helbrute's chassis activated, powered by the energy still available to them, and filled the corridor with sound. It was not words, not language, nothing that could be called communication in any meaningful sense. It was pure expression of agony and fury, the scream of a consciousness that had been twisted beyond recognition, that existed in perpetual torment, that wanted nothing except the end of its own suffering and the suffering of everything else in the universe. The sound echoed through the corridors of the tomb, bouncing off walls that had never before heard anything like it. The Canoptech constructs, lacking organic hearing systems, registered it only as vibrations in the air, pressure waves that their sensors could detect, but which meant nothing to them. But to the tomb mind, monitoring the situation through multiple sensory feeds, the scream represented data. The pitch, the frequency, the modulation. All of it was analyzed and added to the constantly updating profile of the anomalous entity. And deeper in the tomb, in corridors that were just beginning to show signs of renewed activity, the scream reached the audio sensors of awakening Necron warriors. These simple constructs had no context for such sounds, no emotional response to the clear expression of agony they represented, but they registered the direction from which the sound came, marked it as the location of potential threat, and continued their awakening process with that information integrated into their basic tactical programming. The cryptech, moving through the tomb with the confidence of a being who had walked these halls for millions of years, also heard the scream. His senses provided perfect reproduction of the sound, and his consciousness, sophisticated enough to approach something like true understanding, analyzed what it heard. This was not a mechanical sound. This was something organic, something alive, something suffering. The corruption that had created the anomalous entity had not eliminated the consciousness of whoever piloted it. That individual remained aware, trapped, in pain. Interesting. The cryptech's curiosity, that strange remnant of the scientist he had been before biotransference, was engaged. This was not simply a demon engine or a corrupted machine. This was a fusion of technology and tortured consciousness, something that combined the worst aspects of organic life and mechanical existence. The study of such an entity could provide valuable insights into the nature of consciousness itself, into the relationship between mind and body, into the effects of long-term sensory deprivation and pain on cognitive function. The cryptech increased his pace, eager to see this anomaly for himself, to begin the analysis that would determine its ultimate fate. Behind him, in the chambers he had just left, the Necron warriors were fully awakening, their stasis fields collapsing entirely as they rose from their crypts for the first time in millennia. They would follow their programming, would report to designated assembly points, would prepare to receive orders from whatever commander awakened to lead them. The tomb was fully rousing now, not to full war readiness, but to a state of heightened alertness. The automated defenses remained active. The canoptech constructs continued their patrol patterns, now expanded to include more frequent checks on critical systems. Power flowed through circuits that had been dark for thousands of years. The tomb mind, that vast artificial intelligence that had maintained lonely vigil over the sleeping dynasty, was now coordinating multiple active systems simultaneously, managing a level of activity it had not experienced since the last time the tomb world had faced a serious threat. All of this awakening and activity and preparation was focused on a single objective: understanding and containing one chaos Helbrute that had found its way into a place it should never have been. The tomb would not rest until this contamination in its halls had been properly dealt with, until the threat was eliminated or contained so thoroughly that it could never pose danger to the sleeping dynasty again. The Helbrute's scream eventually died away, not because the pilot's rage had diminished, but because his power reserves could no longer sustain even this simple act of defiance. The Vox speakers fell silent, and the corridor was left with only the quiet hum of canoptech systems and the subtle vibration of living metal maintaining its structure. The Helbrute slumped in its chains, weapons systems powering down to minimal operational levels, the pilot inside his sarcophagus unable to maintain the energy expenditure required for resistance. The canoptech Spider detected this change immediately. Its threat assessment algorithms noted the reduction in power signature, the cessation of hostile action, the general decrease in active threat level. The scarabs had finished reinforcing the chains, turning them into restraints that would require force equivalent to a tank's main weapon to break. The situation had, for the moment, been contained. But the Spider did not relax its vigilance. It maintained its position, particle beamer still charged and ready, watching the Helbrute with the eternal patience of a machine that had no concept of fatigue or boredom. It would wait here for as long as necessary, would continue its watch until either the threat was eliminated or higher authority relieved it of this duty. time meant nothing to it. Only the mission mattered. Only the protection of the tomb and its sleeping masters had any significance. In this way, Necron technology faced off against chaos corruption, cold logic against mad rage, ancient patience against contemporary fury. The outcome of this standoff would ultimately be determined not by the constructs or the chained Helbrute, but by the awakening consciousness of the Cryptek who was rapidly approaching, bringing with him knowledge and capabilities that would turn this encounter from a simple containment operation into something far more significant. The corridor where the Helbrute waited had become, in the span of a few hours, the most active location in the entire tomb. The tomb's ancient silence had been broken by weapons fire, by screams, by the thrum of canoptek engines and the whisper of scarab wings. And now, as the Cryptek drew closer, as Necron warriors assembled in the chambers behind him, the next phase of this impossible encounter was about to begin. The Cryptek's designation, in the complex mathematical notation the Necrons used among themselves, translated roughly to Examiner of Anomalous Technologies Encountered During Conquest Operations, though such a translation failed to capture the layered meanings and contextual data embedded in the original designation. For simplicity, the Imperium's xenoarchaeologists, had they known of his existence, might have simply called him Technolus, from fragments of his name captured in ancient Xenotech ruins. But the Cryptek cared nothing for how lesser races might label him. His identity was defined by his function, his purpose, his role in the dynasty he served. He had been a scientist before biotransference, one of the most brilliant minds of his generation in a civilization that prized scientific achievement above nearly all else. The Necron had been desperate for any advantage against the Old Ones, for any technology that might help them win the war in heaven, and brilliant scientists had been treated as treasures, resources too valuable to risk in combat. When biotransference had come, he had been among the first to undergo the procedure, his consciousness deemed too valuable to lose, even if the body that housed it had to be sacrificed. The body he now inhabited was a masterpiece of Necrontier engineering, far more sophisticated than the simple frames given to the warrior caste. Where they were little more than ambulatory weapons platforms, his form incorporated systems designed to analyze, to experiment, to manipulate reality at fundamental levels. His sensors could detect phenomena that most races could not even theorize about. His manipulator arms could work at scales ranging from the planetary to the molecular. His computational systems could process information faster than most spacecraft's cogitator arrays, running simulations and calculations with a speed and precision that approached the divine. As he moved through the tomb toward the Helbrute's location, he reviewed the data the canoptek constructs had gathered. The information was comprehensive, detailing every aspect of the anomalous entity that the construct's sensors could detect. But it was also, the Cryptek concluded, ultimately insufficient. The constructs could catalogue what they saw, but they lacked the capability to truly understand. They could note that flesh had fused with metal, but they could not determine the mechanisms by which this fusion had occurred, or what it might reveal about the nature of biological and mechanical integration. The Cryptek would provide that understanding. His consciousness, shaped by millions of years of accumulated knowledge and experience, approached the problem from angles the constructs could never consider. He knew the history of the war in heaven, had personally witnessed demon engines and reality-warping technologies deployed by the ancient enemies. He understood the nature of the warp, how it could corrupt and transform, how it could merge with technology to create things that violated natural law. This understanding would allow him to contextualize what he was about to see, to place it within frameworks of knowledge that predated the Imperium of man by vast spans of time. He entered the corridor where the Helbrute waited, his optical sensors immediately capturing every detail of the scene. The canoptek spider remained on station, weapons ready, but not firing, maintaining its vigilant watch over the chained war machine. Scarabs floated throughout the space, creating a perimeter that would detect any change in the situation instantly. And at the center of all this attention, Slumped in its reinforced chains, the Helbrute itself crouched like some great corrupted beast. The cryptek stopped a safe distance away, far enough that any sudden movement from the Helbrute would give him time to respond, but close enough that his sensors could conduct detailed analysis. He activated scanning systems that the Canoptek constructs did not possess, sophisticated arrays that could penetrate the Helbrute's armor and examine what lay beneath without the need for physical contact. Energies invisible to human eyes, radiations that existed in spectra that most races could not detect, washed over the Helbrute as the cryptek began his examination. The data that flowed into his consciousness was disturbing, even by the standards of a being who had witnessed the most horrific weapons of the war in heaven. The fusion of flesh and metal was not a deliberate design, but a corruption, an ongoing process that continued even now at the microscopic level. The organic tissue was attempting to assimilate the mechanical systems, while the mechanical systems were simultaneously trying to encapsulate and contain the organic matter. It was a battle being fought in every joint, every connection, every point where the two different states of matter met, a struggle that would never end because neither side could ever truly win. The sarcophagus at the Helbrute's heart revealed something even more troubling. Inside was a consciousness, a sapient entity that remained aware despite conditions that should have rendered awareness impossible. The cryptek's sensors detected bioelectric activity consistent with active thought processes, with consciousness operating at levels that suggested the pilot was not merely alive, but aware of his situation. The pain receptors throughout what remained of the organic body were continuously firing, sending signals of agony to a brain that had long since lost the ability to process such sensations in any normal way. But what truly captured the cryptek's attention was the warp signature. The Helbrute emitted a low-level psychic radiation, a corruption that permeated its entire structure. It was not possessing demon, not a true demon engine with an entity from the Imperium bound into its systems. Instead, it was something that had been so thoroughly exposed to warp energies that it had become permanently tainted, the corruption woven into its very structure at the quantum level. The flesh, the metal, even the consciousness of the pilot, all of it carried this taint, this mark of exposure to forces that most beings could not survive. The cryptek found this fascinating. During the war in heaven, they had encountered many warp-corrupted entities, but those had been created by the Old Ones and their allies. Beings who understood the Imperium on fundamental levels and could deliberately design weapons that channeled its power. This Helbrute, by contrast, seemed to be an accidental creation, the result of corruption and exposure rather than deliberate engineering. It was a failure mode of technology. What happened when machine systems were exposed to warp influence without proper understanding or precautions? He transmitted a command to the Canoptek spider, instructing it to maintain its position, but to lower its weapons. There was no immediate threat here, not while the chains held and the Helbrute's power reserves remained depleted. The cryptek wanted to conduct a more detailed examination, wanted to understand the exact mechanisms by which this corruption functioned. Such knowledge could prove valuable in future encounters with similar entities, could inform the development of countermeasures, or perhaps even methods to deliberately create such corruption in enemy systems. The cryptek extended one of his manipulator arms, reaching toward the Helbrute with a limb equipped with sensors even more sophisticated than those built into his main chassis. He would sample the corrupted metal directly, would analyze its structure at the atomic level, would determine exactly what the warp had done to transform mundane materials into this tainted state. Before his manipulator could make contact, the Helbrute stirred. The pilot, who had been conserving his remaining power reserves, who had been waiting in his sarcophagus with the patient fury of one who has spent millennia learning to endure, felt the approach of this new threat. Unlike the Canoptek constructs, which registered to his sensors as barely sapient machines, this entity radiated intelligence. The pilot could sense, through his cybernetic connections, that he faced something with true consciousness, something that could think and plan and understand. And he could also sense something else. This entity had no soul. The Helbrute's pilot, corrupted as he was by long exposure to chaos, had developed a rudimentary psychic sensitivity, a sixth sense that allowed him to detect the presence or absence of souls. Most living things created ripples in the warp, generated presence that his tainted consciousness could perceive. But this approaching entity created nothing. It was a void, an absence, a thing that existed purely in the material universe with no reflection in the immaterium. The pilot's madness interpreted this absence as the ultimate insult. Here was a being that had achieved what the Chaos Gods claimed was impossible: existence without a soul, consciousness without dependence on the warp. The pilot had been promised power through chaos, had been told that his suffering had meaning, that his transformation into a Helbrute was a dark blessing that granted him capability beyond what he had possessed before. And here stood proof that all of that was a lie, that consciousness could exist, that sophisticated thought could function, without any connection to the powers that had so thoroughly corrupted him. The rage that had been carefully hoarded, the energy reserves that had been painstakingly maintained, now surged through the Helbrute's systems with desperate fury. The pilot knew he had one chance, one opportunity to strike before this soulless thing touched him, examined him, reduced him to a mere curiosity to be studied and dissected. He would not allow that. He would not become a specimen. If he was to be destroyed, it would be in battle, in glorious violence, in one final expression of the fury that had kept him going through 10,000 years of torment. Every system in the Helbrute activated simultaneously. Power flowed from the core in a surge that would have killed any organic pilot. But the heavily modified body in the sarcophagus absorbed the overload, channeling it through cybernetic interfaces into weapons and actuators. The chains, reinforced as they were by scarab modifications, suddenly found themselves tested by forces beyond their design specifications. The power fist, its disruption field activating at maximum intensity, struck at the chain, holding it with enough force to crack stone. The chain held, but only barely, its structure groaning under stress that threatened to tear apart its molecular bonds. The Helbrute's other arm, the one mounting the multi-melter, attempted to aim despite the restraints, its targeting systems locking onto the cryptech with desperate urgency. The weapon began to charge, capacitors filling with energy, the fusion reactor at its core reaching critical temperature. The Helbrute would fire, would unleash its most powerful weapon, would accept its own destruction if only it could take this soulless abomination with it. The cryptech's response was instantaneous and comprehensive. His consciousness, operating at speeds that made human thought seem glacial, assessed the situation and initiated multiple responses simultaneously. First, he transmitted a priority alert to the tomb mind: active threat, immediate elimination authorized. Second, he activated his own defensive systems, energy shields snapping into place around him with technologies that could repel weapons far more powerful than anything this crude war machine possessed. Third, he commanded the Canoptech constructs to attack with maximum prejudice, holding nothing back. The Canoptech Spider fired its particle beamer. The weapon discharged with a scream of violated physics, its beam punching through the Helbrute's armor with contemptuous ease. The energy penetrated deep into the chassis, burning through corrupted metal and twisted flesh alike, seeking the power core at the war machine's heart. The Helbrute shuddered as the beam carved through its structure, but the pilot kept his systems active through pure force of will, refusing to shut down, refusing to accept that he was already dead. The multi-melter fired. Its beam lanced out toward the cryptech. Superheated fusion energy capable of melting through the armor of heavy tanks. But the beam struck the cryptech's shields and simply scattered, reflected away in random directions by defensive systems that manipulated local reality to redirect incoming energy. The walls around the combat zone glowed with transferred heat, living metal once again struggling to repair damage from weapons it had never been designed to withstand. The scarabs, responding to the cryptech's commands, abandoned their perimeter positions, and swarmed the Helbrute, in numbers that turned the air around the war machine into a solid mass of flying metal. They descended on every exposed system, every weapon, every joint and connection, and began their work of disassembly with frantic urgency. The corrupted flesh that had fused with the chassis proved resistant to their molecular manipulation tools, but the pure metal components yielded quickly, being stripped away and reduced to energy. The power fist struck at the swarm, crushing dozens of scarabs with each blow, but for every construct destroyed, 2 more took its place. The spider was manufacturing new scarabs even as the battle raged, expending energy to create replacements faster than the Helbrute could eliminate them. The war machine's movements became increasingly restricted as its weapons were stripped away, as joints were disabled, as the scarabs literally disassembled it one component at a time. Throughout all of this, the cryptech maintained his position behind his shields, watching with the detached interest of a scientist observing an experiment. He was recording everything, capturing every detail of how the Helbrute fought, how its systems functioned, how the corruption responded to damage and stress. This data would be valuable regardless of the outcome of the combat. If the Helbrute was destroyed, the data would inform future encounters with similar entities. If it survived, the data would guide decisions about its ultimate disposition. Behind the cryptech, in the corridors he had passed through to reach this location, Necron warriors were arriving. These simple constructs had heard the sounds of combat, had received transmissions from the tomb mind updating them on the active threat, and had marched toward the sound of weapons fire with the patient inevitability that defined their existence. They formed ranks in the wider sections of corridor, their gorse flayers raised and ready, waiting for orders to advance and eliminate the threat if it proved too much for the Canoptech constructs to handle. The Helbrute was losing. This was obvious even to the pilot in his madness, even through the rage and pain that clouded his judgment. His weapons were being systematically destroyed. His power reserves were depleting rapidly. The particle beamer had caused catastrophic damage to his internal systems, damage that even the corrupted flesh could not repair. He was dying, his chassis failing around him, and there was nothing he could do to prevent it. In these final moments, something changed in the pilot's consciousness. The rage began to ebb, not from acceptance or peace, but from simple exhaustion. He had been angry for so long, had existed in a state of perpetual fury for millennia. And now, faced with inevitable destruction, he found that he simply did not have the energy to maintain that anger anymore. The madness that had defined his existence began to crack, allowing fragments of the consciousness that had existed before his entombment to surface. He remembered things he thought had been lost forever. He remembered his name, his real name, the one he had carried before corruption had made him into this thing. He remembered his chapter, the colors of their armor, the oaths they had sworn. He remembered the battle where he had been wounded, the desperate fight against enemies he could no longer quite visualize. And he remembered the moment when he had been told he would be placed in a dreadnought, when he had thought he would continue to serve, when he had believed his suffering had meaning and purpose. He understood now that it had all been lies. The promises of power, the claims that his transformation was a blessing, the assurances that his pain served the will of gods, all of it had been deception. He was not blessed. He was cursed. He had been turned into a weapon that his own warband feared, chained like an animal, unleashed only to kill, given no purpose beyond destruction and no hope of anything better. The Necrons, at least, were honest in their nature. They were machines animated by consciousness, existing without souls, fighting because that was what they were designed to do. There was a purity in that, a clarity that stood in stark contrast to the lies of chaos. These ancient Xenos were not promising salvation or glory or power. They were simply protecting their tomb, eliminating threats, following protocols that had been established millions of years ago. They were, in their own way, more pure than he had ever been. The Helbrute's power core failed. The particle beam had damaged it beyond any hope of repair, and the strain of combat had pushed it past its limits. The war machine's systems began to shut down one by one, weapons falling silent, sensors going dark, actuators losing power and freezing in whatever position they had last achieved. The pilot felt his connection to the chassis weakening, the cybernetic interfaces that had kept him aware of every aspect of the war machine's function beginning to dissolve. He was dying, truly dying this time, not the false death of dormancy or the living death of entombment, but the final cessation of consciousness that he had been denied for so long. As the darkness closed in around him, as the pain that had been his constant companion for millennia finally began to fade, he found that he was grateful. Whatever came next, whether it was oblivion or judgment or something else entirely, it had to be better than what he had endured. His last thought, carried through failing systems and transmitted by Vox speakers that barely functioned, was a single word. Not a curse or a threat or a declaration of defiance, just a word, spoken with all the sincerity that remained in his corrupted consciousness. Please. And then he was gone. The consciousness that had piloted the Helbrute for 10,000 years finally released its grip on existence, accepting the oblivion it had been denied for so long. The war machine's form slumped completely in its chains, all animation leaving it, all the terrible vitality that had made it dangerous draining away. What remained was just metal and flesh, no longer fused by will and suffering, but simply dead materials that would decay like any other corpse. The cryptech detected the cessation of consciousness through his sensors, noted the complete shutdown of all bioelectric activity in the organic components. The Helbrute was no longer a threat. It was simply a collection of materials, some conventional, some corrupted, but all now inert and safe to examine. He deactivated his shields and approached the war machine, this time without concern for sudden attacks or desperate last stands. The scarabs were already at work, now focused not on destruction, but on containment. They covered the Helbrute's form in layers of living metal, drawn from their own mass, and from materials they had disassembled from the damaged corridor walls. They were creating a tomb within the tomb, sealing the corrupted war machine in layers of material that would prevent any warp energies from escaping, that would contain the taint and prevent it from spreading to other systems. By the time they finished, the Helbrute would be completely encased, preserved for study, but isolated from anything it might contaminate. The cryptech examined the now inert war machine with the careful attention of a scientist presented with a valuable specimen. He sampled the corrupted metal, analyzed the fusion of flesh and machine, studied the technologies that had been used to create this abomination. His findings confirmed what he had suspected. This was not sophisticated engineering, but brute force application of warp corruption to conventional systems. There was knowledge here, but it was knowledge of what not to do, of the dangers of allowing chaos to touch technology without proper understanding or precautions. The final report he transmitted to the Tomb Mind was comprehensive. The anomalous entity had been eliminated, the threat had been contained, the corrupted materials had been sealed in stasis fields that would prevent any further degradation or spread of taint. And most importantly, valuable data had been gathered that would inform future encounters with similar threats. The Tomb Mind acknowledged this report and issued new instructions. Return to dormancy all systems that had been awakened specifically to address this threat. Throughout the tomb, Necron warriors that had been mobilized began to return to their crypts. Stasis fields reactivated around them, returning them to the long sleep from which they had been so briefly roused. Canoptech constructs that had been diverted from their normal duties returned to their patrol patterns, scarabs resuming their endless maintenance cycles, spiders going back to overseeing repairs in other sections of the tomb. The heightened alert level dropped back to normal standby operations. The tomb settled back into its ancient stillness, now only slightly marred by the presence of the sealed and contained Helbrute. The cryptech himself would return to stasis. but not immediately. He had work to do first, analyses to complete, data to organize and store in the tomb's archives. He would study the samples he had taken, would run simulations based on what he had observed, would ensure that every fragment of knowledge that could be extracted from this encounter was properly preserved. Only when this work was complete, when he was satisfied that he had learned everything possible from the anomaly, would he return to his own crypt and embrace the darkness of stasis once again. But before he did so, he spent a moment considering the Helbrute's final word, transmitted through failing systems in the last seconds of its pilot's consciousness. Please. It had been a plea, though for what the cryptech could only speculate. Mercy, release, understanding. The emotional context was lost on a being who had not felt emotions in any organic sense for millions of years. But intellectually, he recognized what he had witnessed, a consciousness that had endured suffering beyond any reasonable limit, that had found in death the escape it had been seeking. The cryptech felt nothing for this lost consciousness, no pity or regret or satisfaction. He was incapable of such feelings, but he understood that he had observed something significant, proof that even after 10,000 years of corruption and madness, some fragment of the original consciousness could survive, could resurface in the final moments to express authentic thought rather than programmed rage. This was valuable data about the resilience of consciousness, about the limits of what corruption could achieve. He filed this information away in his crystalline memory matrices, adding it to the vast accumulation of knowledge he had gathered over millions of years. It would sit there with observations from the war in heaven, with data on extinct civilizations, with records of weapons and technologies that had been lost to time. And perhaps someday, this knowledge would prove useful. Perhaps understanding the nature of consciousness under extreme duress would inform some future project, some experiment, some innovation that would benefit the dynasty. Or perhaps not. Perhaps this knowledge would remain unused, just another entry in databases so vast that even the cryptech himself could not fully comprehend their contents. It did not matter. Knowledge was its own justification. Understanding was its own reward. He had learned something new, and that was enough. The cryptech turned away from the sealed Helbrute and began to make his way back through the tomb, his mission accomplished, his purpose fulfilled. Behind him, the scarabs put the finishing touches on their containment work, ensuring that every last trace of warp corruption was sealed away where it could not touch the clean metal and stone of the tomb. The living metal of the walls had finally managed to repair the damage caused by the multi-melter, the glowing scars fading as molecular-scale construction processes restored the structure to its original state. Within the sealed cocoon, the Helbrute sat in perfect stillness, its pilot's body dead at last, his consciousness finally granted the oblivion it had sought for so long. The war machine would remain here, entombed within the larger tomb, a monument to the dangers of chaos corruption and a warning to any who might discover it in the distant future. If the tomb ever fully awakened, if the dynasty rose from its long sleep to reclaim the galaxy, perhaps the sealed Helbrute would be studied by other cryptechs, its secrets fully unraveled, its every corruption mapped and catalogued. Or perhaps it would simply remain here forever, sealed and forgotten. Another mystery buried in a tomb world that held a million such mysteries. Another relic of the 41st Millennium preserved in stasis for eternity. The Necrons cared nothing for glory or remembrance. They cared only for order, for preservation, for the careful maintenance of their tomb, and the protection of the dynasty it contained. And so the tomb returned to silence. The corridors that had echoed with weapons fire and anguished screams were now filled only with the quiet hum of Canoptech systems and the whisper of living metal maintaining its structure. The tomb mind resumed its lonely vigil, monitoring millions of systems, maintaining the stasis fields that kept the dynasty in their long sleep, waiting for the day when the full awakening would come. When that day arrived, if it ever did, the Necrons would rise to find a galaxy very different from the one they had left. They would face enemies that had not existed when they entered their tombs, would encounter technologies and threats that their databases had no records of. But they would also bring with them knowledge and capabilities that no other race could match, weapons and systems refined over millions of years, an understanding of the universe that predated the Imperium of man by vast spans of time. And among all their accumulated knowledge, among all their preserved specimens and catalogued artifacts, there would be one sealed container deep in the maintenance levels, a cocoon of living metal containing the preserved remains of a chaos Helbrute and the data gathered from its final battle. This knowledge would inform their understanding of the warp's corrupting influence, would help them develop countermeasures and strategies for dealing with similar threats. The Necrons would be ready. They were always ready. That was the nature of their existence, the purpose they had been given when biotransference transformed them from living beings into something else. They were the inheritors of one of the galaxy's oldest civilizations, the survivors of the war in heaven, the ancient enemy that had slumbered while younger races rose and fell like waves on a beach. And they were patient. They had all the time in the universe. They could wait for millennia more if necessary, could sleep through ages while the galaxy burned around them, and when they finally rose, they would bring with them the accumulated wisdom of countless eons. The encounter with the Helbrute had lasted mere hours, but the knowledge gained from it would serve them for as long as the dynasty endured. This is what happens when Necrons find a chaos Helbrute sleeping in their tomb. Not glorious battle or epic confrontation, but cold analysis and methodical containment. Not dramatic speeches or philosophical debates, but clinical examination and efficient elimination of threats. The Necrons do not rage or boast or celebrate. They simply act, following protocols refined over millions of years, applying force precisely calibrated to the situation, and then returning to their dormancy until next they are needed. The Helbrute's pilot had sought glory through chaos, had believed that suffering and corruption would grant him power and purpose. Instead, he had found only madness and a cage of corrupted metal. In the end, his only escape had come through the cold efficiency of the very enemy he might have fought, through mechanisms that cared nothing for his suffering or his story. The Necrons had not killed him out of hatred or righteousness. They had simply determined he was a threat and eliminated that threat with the same dispassion they would apply to repairing a damaged circuit. This, perhaps, is the ultimate horror of the Necrons. Not their weapons, though those are fearsome, not their immortality, though that is imposing, but their absolute lack of passion, their complete absence of soul, their existence as consciousnesses that think and plan and act without any connection to the emotions and drives that define organic life. They are the cold, mathematical inevitability of entropy given form and purpose. They are what remains when everything that makes life worth living has been stripped away. And they are waking. All across the galaxy, tomb worlds are stirring from their ancient sleep. The Necrons are rising, bringing with them technologies and knowledge that humanity can barely comprehend. They do not come as saviors or conquerors in the traditional sense. They simply come to reclaim what was once theirs, to restore the order that existed before the younger races inherited the stars. The encounter with the Helbrute was just one small moment in their vast awakening, one brief interaction that would barely merit a footnote in their extensive records. But it demonstrated with perfect clarity what happens when the ancient Xenos face the corruptions of chaos. Clinical analysis, methodical response, efficient elimination, no drama, no passion, just the cold application of technologies and protocols that have proven their worth over millions of years. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, the Necrons represent something perhaps more terrifying than war itself. They represent war reduced to its purest form, violence stripped of all passion and meaning, death delivered with the mechanical precision of a galaxy-spanning machine that has no concept of mercy or malice, only the imperative to function according to its programming. The Helbrute's pilot learned this in his final moments. He had sought meaning in his suffering, purpose in his corruption, glory in his transformation into a weapon of chaos. What he found instead was that none of it mattered, that all his rage and pain and madness were irrelevant to beings who simply did not care about such things. The Necrons had not judged him or condemned him. They had simply determined he was a threat and dealt with him accordingly, as they would deal with any threat, organic or mechanical, corrupt or pure. And then they had returned to their sleep, their tomb settling back into the silence that had defined it for millions of years, waiting for the next awakening, the next threat, the next encounter with the galaxy that had grown up around them during their long slumber. This is the way of the Necrons. This is their strength and their horror. And this is what waits in the tombs buried on dead worlds throughout the galaxy, sleeping still, but not forever. The awakening has begun. The ancient enemy is rising. And when they fully emerge from their tombs, when all the dynasties stand restored and ready, the galaxy will remember what fear truly means. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into one of Warhammer 40K's most fascinating theoretical encounters, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. We explore the darkest corners of the 41st Millennium, bringing you detailed analyses and scenarios that bring the lore to life. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload, and let us know in the comments what other impossible encounters you'd like to see explored. Until next time, may your sleep never be disturbed by things that should not wake.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.